ॐ नमो नारायणाय ॐ नमो नारायणाय
Asmat Gurubhyo Namaha, Asmat Parama Gurubhyo Namaha, Asmat Sarva Gurubhyo Namaha. So today we're going to start with a book called The Vedanta by Dr. Gate. And it's quite a nice book. Let's go straight to it. So it looks like this is part of a series, Government Oriental Series, Class C, number 1, the Vedanta, a study of the Brahma Sutras, or otherwise known as Vedanta Sutras, with the bhashyas or commentaries of Shankara, Ramanuja, Nimbarka, Madhva, and Vallabha. Wow, that's a lot. Okay, so by V.S. Gate, and apparently got his doctorate in Paris, right? Late professor of Sanskrit at Elephantstone College, Bombay, otherwise known as Mumbai today. Okay, so 1926. All right, let's have a look. This is the table of contents. So it looks like he's dealing with the 5 schools of Vedanta, the five major schools of Vedanta, of course, Shankara, Ramanuja, and Madhva being the main 3, and then also Nimbarka and Vallabha. There are, of course, other forms of Vedanta, other schools of Vedanta. There's the Gaudiya school by Baladev Vidyabhushan's commentaries. Doesn't deal with that here, and there are some other commentaries also. It's not being dealt with, but he's basically going to compare all those, and it's quite a short book, maybe 200 pages. So he won't be probably going into depth, but it'll give us a good idea. And then he starts out by giving us a little bit general understanding of the different periods of Sanskrit philosophy. Okay, and then an outline of the four chapters that the Brahma Sutras or Vedanta Sutras have, and the four padas means 4 sections of each chapter, right? And then something at the conclusion. Okay, good. All right, so preface by the editor. So apparently the Dr. Gate died before this could be printed, and maybe it even had to be let's see. Anyway, the literary career of the late Dr. Gate was cut short by a premature death that which believed all expectations. Okay, the present work was offered by him in 1918 as a thesis for the doctorate of Paris University. Being written in French, it was inaccessible to most Indian readers, and therefore the authorities of the Bhandarkar Institute, which is Bhandarkar Oriental Research Institute, which is a very famous institute in Pune, in Maharashtra, in India, right? They came out with works like the unabridged, critical edition of the Mahabharata, which took them many years. It's a very famous Indological institute. Anyway, we're very glad to accept the offer of the heirs and executors of the late Dr. Gate to transfer to the institute the copyright of what appeared to be a complete English translation of the work. Okay, I undertook, this is the editor speaking, I undertook most willingly to see the work through the press on behalf of the heirs of the late Dr. Gate, whom I owe a debt of gratitude as his pupil at the Deccan College. Deccan College usually is in Chennai, in Madras. Okay, so on examination, however, I found that the copy entrusted to me was not a translation of the French work, but the original draft of it in English, which was changed occasionally while it was being translated. Okay, I had therefore to take some liberties with the text of Dr. Gate's manuscript, although I have tried to make them as few as possible, consistently with the desire to give an unambiguous text, which was also in conformity with the French version. So it appears that Dr. Gate originally wrote had made notes for his thesis this is his doctoral thesis, apparently. in English, and then translated it into French because he was at a French university. And somehow or other, the editor here got the original notes, but he also looked at the finished work in French, and he had to sort of because obviously from the notes, maybe Gade changed some of the things when he wrote the French version. Okay, so there are a few inconsistencies that still remain, and there must be typographical imperfections also in the present edition, for which I ought to take my full share of responsibility. Most people say this, most authors and editors say this sort of thing, that there may be some mistakes. I can only say that I have given it all my energy and vigilance, for which, unfortunately, I have not the full measure. Humble guy, okay. I hope that the reader will accept this circumstance with some extenuation of all my faults. VG Orange Pay. Okay. Author's preface. So this is by Dr. Gate. The problem as to what is the doctrine contained in the Brahma Sutras of Badarayana, or in other words, which among the 5 well-known commentaries gives the most faithful interpretation of them, has occupied my mind since long. I was therefore very glad to have the permission of the Faculty of Arts of the University of Paris to offer to it, in the form of a thesis, the results of my study on the subject and my reflections on it. I leave it to the reader to decide if the conclusions at which I have arrived are or are not satisfactory. I only hope that the method followed in the treatment of the subject would appear to be reasonable and in strict conformity with the rules of Western criticism. Okay, so this, he's going to use some rules of Western critical thinking to apply his ideas on Vedanta. Okay, so if this venture of mine succeeds in arousing some interest in Sanskrit philosophy, and more particularly in removing the idea, which is now current in Europe, that the sum of the Vedanta is to be found in the system of Shankara, I shall consider that my labor will not have been in vain. So this is a very good point. So he wrote this at a time when Western scholars, and perhaps even still today, consider that Shankara's commentary on the Vedanta is basically the standard, and they don't really know so much about any other commentaries, and he wants to remedy that. So I have to thank Dr. F.W. Thomas for the kindness that he has shown me in placing at my disposal books and manuscripts from the Library of the India Office, and in giving me his valuable advice whenever it was needed. The untiring cooperation of MP Mason Orsell has likewise been of the greatest help to me, especially on account of his unrivaled knowledge of philosophic terminology, Oriental as well as Occidental, right? So Eastern as well as Western, right? So the library of M.E. Senart has been of great use to me, and I insist on giving an expression here to my sense of gratitude to him. But above all things, I owe a debt of gratitude to M. Sylvain Levy and M.A. Foucher. It is thanks to their guidance and their encouragement that this humble attempt has seen the light of day. I have not words with which to express all that I feel when I think of all the precious time that these savants have spared for me, and of the affectionate sympathy that they have shown for me during my stay in Paris. I need not say what a source of information and of inspiration has been to me their heart-to-heart talk, in the course of which they gave freely of their treasures of erudition and of the finesse of their critical mind. I shall ever carry with me an imperishable memory of the hours which it was my privilege to spend in their company. Okay, great. All right, so that's the preface and the so forward preface, whatever. Introduction. So here, now we're going to get into it. So introduction, generalities. A Maratha, that means a person from Maharashtra in India, right? A Maratha who was both a poet and a saint, has said in a very well-known line, Jagi Sarva Sukhi Asa Kona Ahe. Who is there in this world who is perfectly happy? The reply is, of course, no one. Not only is no one perfectly happy, but no one is happy even. For, as we see, no happiness is unmixed, right? There's no pure happiness apparently in this world. Okay, so, and even in the midst of the highest happiness, the thought, or rather the fear of losing its half, losing it half mars the enjoyment. Hence, it is that thinkers have always sought to find something which would secure eternal happiness, something which you can never lose, that is to say, something which would ever remain with you. A slight consideration will show that nothing in this world can fulfill this test unless it forms part and parcel of you, as in other words, it is yourself. For whatever is outside of you or outside you can never remain eternally with you. It is yourself alone which you can depend upon as something that is never to leave you. Hence, the search after eternal happiness led, in its turn, to the search after the self, to philosophy. Who am I? Koham in Sanskrit. Koham means kaha aham, becomes koham with sandhi, right? Is the chief question with which all philosophy is in the first place concerned. Whence do I come? Where do I go? Are questions which naturally follow in its train. It is these questions to which every school of philosophy attempts to furnish a reply, and it is these questions which have always occupied the seers of ancient India, her prophets and teachers, her saints and poets. And if I may say so, it is not the search after truth by itself, but the search after truth as actuated by the search after eternal beatitude that is at the root of all Sanskrit philosophy. However, that beatitude may be called by the name moksha, or deliverance, or ananda, joyousness, or nirvana, complete extinction, or any other name. And I believe that this is more natural, as it is more human, in accordance with the saying, prayojana anudrishya na, now it's either, I think that's mandopi pravartate. Even a fool does not proceed without having some object in view. Well, that's a good saying, right? So the consideration of the main questions stated above cannot be satisfactorily carried on without at the same time taking note of many other side questions or side question. For example, those about the means of knowledge, pramanas, right? The processes by which we attain true knowledge, the nature of heaven and hell, the nature of God, the practices to be observed in order to arrive at the right knowledge, the different paths leading to beatitude, etc. Thus, there are more aspects or disciplines of philosophy than one, amongst which may be mentioned the following, which are principal. Number 1, metaphysics. Number 2, natural philosophy. Number 3, psychology, to which may be added eschatology. Eschatology means the dealing with the subjects about the afterlife, let's say, about after this life. Number 1, there are 2 ways of looking at the universe. I think we're talking about metaphysics here because he's given the topics as 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 1, 2, 3, 4, right? Metaphysics, natural philosophy, psychology, and eschatology. Okay, so number 1, so metaphysics. There are 2 ways of looking at the universe with all of its manifestations. One is to investigate the forms in which the universe appears to us, that is, to our senses, which is the domain of the so-called science, right? And the other is to consider the very essence of the phenomena independently of how they affect our senses, leading thus to the science of metaphysics. This latter sets before itself the task of knowing what is behind or beyond the universe, which is both in us and around us. It endeavors to grasp the hidden springs that move the world. It longs to enter into the mysteries of the great unknown. Metaphysics thus inquires into the first and the last and first cause, and is the science of the really existent. He's capitalized that, really existent, as if it, okay, maybe that's his way of translating what in Sanskrit we would say Brahman. He's going to introduce the term Brahman in the next sentence. Thus, questions about Brahman means the great one, or in Sanskrit, it's a term for the great, or we can say the supreme in a sense. Yeah, it's so questions about Brahman, its nature, its relation to the universe, all fall under the discipline of metaphysics, or the doctrine of the philosophical principle. Metaphysics becomes theology, right? So he's making a differentiation here between metaphysics, or what we call philosophy, right, and theology. So metaphysics, or philosophy, becomes theology when the philosophical principle becomes less abstract and is endowed with personal attributes, so as to suit better the longings and limited powers of the human mind. In other words, it is turned into God, right? So when we may conceive of a supreme, but when we start to think about it in concrete terms, then we start to define it as God, and therefore our ideas become more theological in nature. So thus theology is the doctrine of God, or metaphysics made concrete, philosophy made concrete, whereas metaphysics is theology made abstract. I think that's a pretty good understanding. Now, two, what was the second thing here? Was natural philosophy. Before we get to that, let's have a look at the chat. Yeah, so Brahman, what does Brahman mean? Well, we could look at what Brahman means in the dictionary. But basically, if we look in the dictionary, in the Sanskrit dictionary, Brahman in the Sanskrit dictionary, okay, literally growth, expansion, evolution, development, swelling of the spirit or soul. It can mean the Brahman, the one self-existent impersonal spirit, the one universal soul, or the one divine essence, the source from which all is created, all created things emanate, right? And with which they are identified, and which they return to. The self-existent, the absolute, the eternal. These are all dictionary definitions given in Moni Williams Dictionary for the word Brahman in Sanskrit. Okay, so there's a lot of other lot of other things too. I would say that is a very important. That last definition that they gave about Brahman was very important, and comes from the Taittiriya Upanishad. So the Taittiriya Upanishad says, "Yato va imani bhutani jayante yena jatani jivanti yat prayantyabhisham vishanti." That is a definition in Taittiriya Upanishad of the Krishna Yajurveda of what is Brahman, right? It says that from which everything emanates, that by which everything is maintained, and that into which everything enters, that is Brahman. So that's one definition. That's one definition given in the Upanishads. We'll probably see some other definitions as we go along. And all these definitions should be able to be reconciled with one thing. There should be one supreme spirit, or one supreme principle, Godhead, that embodies all of these different definitions that may come up. And the definitions, of course, will not be too different. And the question of discussing philosophy will be where there are different definitions given in the scriptures, and somehow when we read them, we may feel that they either are complementary or they have some opposite meaning. If they seem to be in conflict, then how to rationalize them and how to understand them, two slightly different understandings like that, how to rationalize those things. Okay, so can we make this, we can make this a little bit, can we make this a little bit bigger maybe? Let's see. Okay. Oops, that's too big. All right, there we go. All right, so let us continue on. So next thing was natural philosophy, number 2. So the section 2 here, after talking about metaphysics or philosophy and its relationship to religion or theology, right? We are now going to talk about natural philosophy, I could say. On the other hand, when we deal with the phenomena themselves, phenomena, of course, being the he's using phenomena here, yes, as plural, right? Which should be, right? Otherwise it should be called phenomenon. But anyway, phenomena themselves, their plurality, the order of creation and destruction of the different forms of existence that surround us, in brief, when we concern ourselves with the cosmos, as opposed to the underlying principle of unity, we enter the domain of natural philosophy, better known in modern times by the name cosmology. Okay, so that's that. Now we understand what he means by natural philosophy. He's talking about cosmology, about our understanding of what the universe is, like that, and our place in it, etc. So thus, questions regarding the creation of the elements like ether, air, light, etc., their order of creation and destruction, the classification of living beings, fall under the discipline of cosmology. So that was very succinct. Okay, that's very short. Okay, so 3. Now 3 was, I believe, if we can go back and just see for one section, the third thing was psychology and the 4th thing was eschatology. Okay, so the third thing that he wants to talk about here is so psychology. Apart from the outer world, right? So what have we talked about so far? We talked about the principle of Brahman, or the principle of God, or the great, the great creator, the source of everything, like that, in terms of philosophical understanding of ourselves and God, like that. The second thing was understanding about the world around us, and now he's going to talk about the inner world, the world of the mind, and our understanding of different ideas in mental things. So apart from the outer world, there's the inner world, which is in ourselves, the world of thoughts and emotions, wishes and cognitions, the subtle, vital airs, all having at their head the soul or the ego. An investigation into this inner world forms the subject of the third discipline, psychology. Thus, the theory of the subtle body and the gross body, the sense organs as a means of cognition, internal and external, the vital airs, all of these belong to psychology. Allied to this and forming a subsection of this is logic, which deals with the more concrete instruments of thought and the laws of valid reasoning, which department has been the special preoccupation of the Nyaya school of philosophy. Now, in India, there are six basic schools of philosophy. They're called the Saddarshanas. Sad means 6, Darshana means ways of looking at the world. So Saddarshanas, and they are called Nyaya, Vaisheshika, Yoga, Sankhya, Purva, and Uttaramimamsa, right? Uttaramimamsa being Vedanta. We're studying Vedanta here, right? But there are these other schools. So the Nyaya school, Nyaya means logic. So logic, he's saying here, can fall under his heading of psychology, like that. So logic, and he discussed also before, when we were discussing about philosophy and theology, that there might also be an understanding of coming to right knowledge. How do we come to right knowledge, and ideas about epistemology. In Sanskrit, we say pramanas. The pramana means proofs. How do we prove methods of attaining right knowledge? So that also, logic, nyaya, right, also will help us to understand things correctly. Okay, so the fourth section here is about eschatology. So, 4, eschatology. To these, we may add a fourth discipline, which is much less important and which is called eschatology, dealing with things after death, as heaven and hell, of course, followed by the jiva. Now, jiva literally means life in Sanskrit. It refers to the individual soul, or atman, in philosophy, which is distinguished in some forms of Vedanta from the Paramatman, which is God. And in other forms of Vedanta, it's the word Atman can also sometimes mean God. So here, when he uses the word jiva, he's put in brackets life, so he just simply means life here. The course followed by the jiva, the individual soul. After its departure from the body, the theory of manes or ancestors, or the person, what happens to your ancestors what happens to your parents and grandparents after they die, where do they go, what happens with all those things, etc., like that. So right here, he's acknowledging that the soul is different from the body. The jiva, or the atman, is different. Sometimes we say jivatman to distinguish it from paramatman, which is a name for God. So anyway, so that's that there's some of the subjects which are dealt with in eschatology. Okay, so these are the 4 chief parts of every philosophical system that every philosophical system must contain. In the present place, however, we shall be mainly concerned with the first, that is the metaphysical or philosophical aspect, and with the rest only occasionally. So with the second, which was natural philosophy, right? Third, psychology, and the fourth, eschatology, right? Okay. All right, good. So now, the 3 periods of Sanskrit philosophy. Ancient Sanskrit philosophy divides itself, broadly speaking, into 3 periods. Okay, so we might see that we might see this as a continuum, or we might see, as most people say, there's these different periods. It may depend upon the person. Some people may have theological faiths that this is not correct. But anyway, let's understand, broadly speaking, the way scholars talk about the different periods of Sanskrit philosophy. So number 1, the Vedic. Number 2, the Upanishadic, right? Normally people talk about practitioners of Hinduism and Vaishnavism, or followers of Vedanta. They tend to lump those two together, the Vedic and the Upanishadic, and under the term Shruti. Yeah, it will be nice to know if it will be nice to know if this was, at the time that he wrote this, whether this was an accepted theory by academics in the West or not. We don't know. We'd have to look into that. So anyway, number 1, the Vedic. Number 2, the Upanishadic. And 3, the post-Vedic. Post-Vedic. So even the way even the way that he's made these titles here, he says Vedic and Upanishadic, and then 1, 2, and then 3 is post-Vedic. Well, 3 has to be post-Upanishadic also. So he seems to be acknowledging that Vedic and Upanishadic are Vedic. Anyway, whatever it is, let's see how this develops, which may also be called the cosmological, number 1, the metaphysical, and the systematic. I'm not sure where he's going here, but anyway, representing the 3 stages in gradual intellectual evolution of Indian thought. Okay. So number 1, the Vedic period. So by the Vedic, we mean the period of the Samhitas and the Brahmanas, especially the Rig Veda Samhita, which is by scholars is usually considered the first one or the oldest one. The philosophy of the Veda is rather a loose term, in as much as there is no philosophy proper in the Veda. That's his opinion. The first philosophy of a people is its religion. And the Rig Vedic religion is quite transparent, though developed, chiefly consisting of the personification of natural forces and natural phenomena. Probably at the time, this was all the idea of academia in the West at that time. So what he's attributing Vedic philosophy to be pantheistic. That means that people would worship the supreme, or worship that transcendent force in terms of forces of nature, like the sun and the wind and the rain and the etc. Like that, natural phenomena, natural force, natural phenomena. The most striking features of the Vedic religion are, firstly, it is practical and utilitarian in nature, in that the hymns, so when we're talking about the Brahmanas and even the Aranyakas and the Samhitas, especially the Samhitas, contain suktas or hymns, right? Though highly poetic and inspired in character, are most of them at the same time incidental to the sacrifice. So they're all used in the Vedic religion, which was generally understood to be the religion of sacrifice. There were different sacrifices, fire ceremonies that were performed, and oblations were offered into the fire with these hymns. So give and take is the simple law, which is applicable to the dealings between men and gods. So there was an idea that human beings performed sacrifices, they offered things into the fire like that, and then the gods would give them, the god or gods would give them the results from that. So, and reciprocity, frank, unconditional reciprocity, becomes the accepted motive. Okay, so he's saying like that. Secondly, as a consequence, it is essentially a religion of priests, hieratic religion, right? So in other words, so because the main part of the Vedic religion was sacrifice, and you had to have a priest to perform the sacrifice, so the priestly class and the priests became very important in the Vedic. Whereas if we look at Hinduism today or Vaishnavism today, there are many saints who were not priests, but they were simply lay people, and so there's different forms of religious expression today. But he's saying in the Vedic time, the priests were very important. So thirdly, it is a religion of the upper classes, because there was a class structure in society, and this is of course based on the famous verse from Purusa Suktam, which is in the 10th mandala of the 90th sukta of the Rig Veda. Brahmanosya mukamasid bahu rajanyakutaha uru tarasyad vaishaha padbyam sudro ajayata, which mentions the 4 castes or sections, or we can say varnas in Sanskrit. Varna can mean color, it can also mean caste, it can mean, basically it means a section in society. So we have these 4 types of people in society belonging to a priestly class or an intellectual class, we can say, an administrative class or the princely class, the entrepreneurial class or the business class, or the farmers, the people who own the land. And then you had the workers, you had the whether they were skilled or unskilled, there were the artisans and the workers and things like that formed another class. Okay, so we have these 4 classes. And so the religion was seen as basically having a tiered system where the upper classes, so in this religion, of the upper classes who are well-to-do, right? Who were controlling the lower class, right? The three upper classes, which are called Trivarnikas. Tri means three, Trivarnika. So Varna means the class. So the three top classes, the Brahmins, Kshatriyas, and Vaishyas, the intellectuals, the administrators, and the entrepreneurs. So presupposing an established household of considerable extent. So in order to perform the Vedic rituals, the Vedic ceremonies, the Vedic sacrifices, you had to have money in order to engage the priests to do those things. So the three classes in Indian society that had money like that were the dominant ones, the intellectuals, the administrators, and the entrepreneurs, and the workers worked for them. So basically it becomes mostly a religion of the upper classes. So presupposing an established household of considerable extent, the wealthy and liberal householder, because also coming along with this class system in India, there was also another system of different stages in a person's life. And most people spent the bulk of their life married in a household situation where they could perhaps create more wealth. But then there was a student phase. There was also a couple of different retired phases, right? So what we call in Sanskrit brahmacharya, grahastha, vanaprastha, and sannyasa. So we have a student, a householder, a retired person, and a renounced person waiting for death. And there are different rules in the Smriti Shastras for how these four classes and four stages of life might interact, and there might have been different times in Indian history when they were understood to interact in different ways. Anyhow, so you've got the householder who has accumulated enough wealth to be able to do the sacrifice, the Vedic sacrifice, and so therefore it's mostly in the Vedic period, it's mostly the rich householders who are engaging priests, right, or the Brahmin class to do these Vedic sacrifices. So presupposing an established household of considerable extent, a wealthy and liberal householder, elaborate and expensive materials, right, that had to be offered into the fire, compensation that had to be given to the priests, dakshina, and many different types of priests to perform these elaborate ceremonies. Yeah, so yeah, exactly, social strata. So fourthly, it is essentially optimistic. The Vedic system of religion, essentially optimistic. Basically, you live your life. It's what we call prosperity evangelism. Basically, people are taught that the goal of life is to make money or to accumulate things and to then offer sacrifice, and then you'll get more things from the sacrifice from gods. The gods will bless you. So fourthly, it's essentially optimistic. It is not immortality or heaven, but a long life of a full 100 years, prosperity, warlike offspring. In short, all the blessings of this life that the worshipper or the householder asks for. So what he's saying here is that his idea is that in the Vedic religion, there wasn't so much people were looking for moksha or liberation or something beyond this life, but they were looking to live a good life, right? That's what he's saying. So whether we accept that or not, that we don't have to agree necessarily, but that's okay. So it is a spirit of healthy joy in life we live that dominates. In the life we live, this life, right, that dominates. While such pessimistic ideas as that life is uncertain and unsubstantial, that death is nature or natural, while life is only an accident, are conspicuous by their absence. So we don't find that sort of thing in the Vedic texts. Yeah, of course. So naturally, we find that in general, down through the ages, in both the East and the West, most people live their life in this way. So, okay, so then fifthly, still talking about the Vedic religion here. Fifthly, it is characterized by what may be described as arrested personification. Okay. The Vedic poets, while personifying the power of nature into gods, right? So this is called anthropomorphism. Anthropomorphism is where we see some force in nature, or we see something, and we personify it. We conceive of it in terms that we can understand personally, like in the form like a being, like a human being like ourselves. Like if we look at the Ganges and we say, oh, Mother Ganga is a goddess, we personify the Ganges. That is called anthropomorphism. He's terming it here as arrested personification. Okay, so the Vedic poets, while personifying the power of nature into gods, never allowed this nature worship to be stiffened into mere admiration, fear, or adulteration of personal gods, and never became forgetful of the origin of which sprang the gods. Okay, so he's hinting here at the idea that nature itself, we also, and even the gods have sprung from some original source, which may harken back to what he said about Brahman. Okay, because again, what is the definition of Brahman? Yatova imani bhutani jayane, that from which all these things and persons and living creatures come from, right? So he's including the gods in that also. The original source, let's say. Okay, so sixthly, it shows a tendency to raise the particular god of whom the worshipper is addressing prayers for the time being to the most exalted position, so that all other gods are subordinated to him, or her, I guess, for the moment, a form of religion which has been called catenotheism, right? Catenotheism. Okay. So I haven't heard this term before, but basically the idea behind this, and this is typical of what Indologists understood, is that they thought, okay, these people are praying to many different gods, but whenever they pray to a particular god, they're raising that god above all the others, and they're considering that god to be the greatest or the supreme for that particular, during that particular sacrifice or that particular prayer. That's his idea. But then when they shift to praying to another god, yeah, so monolatry. Okay, monolatry. I'm not sure if I know that word either, but sure, why not? Anyway, so he's given it a name here, catenotheism. So there are some places in the world where people may be still having this sort of a religion like that. We could say present day ordinary Hinduism may be similar sort of have a similar sort of idea. Some people may have this idea. Okay, so notwithstanding the religious character of the Vedic thought in general, there are frequently found references in terms more abstract and philosophical, which may be regarded as the germs of the latter Upanishad thoughts. As in the Vedic religion, the mythological element prevailed, and the moral element, the personified natural forces, being considered as the power that creates, maintains, and controls what man feels in himself as constituting the moral law, opposed to the egoistic tendencies natural to man, though present, was not sufficiently assertive, and the way was gradually paved for doubt and contempt of the gods. See, for instance, as Rig Veda 2:125, 9:112, 7:103, 10:119, etc. We would have to go there and look at the Rig Veda to see what he's actually talking about, which might be a good thing to do outside of class time. Like that, for now, we'll just take his word for it. But he's saying basically here, what is he saying? He's saying that, okay, so in the Vedic religion, there was a mythological element. He calls it mythological element, where people were personifying forms of powers in nature as being personal gods, and therefore these personified natural forces being considered the powers that create, maintain, and control. And naturally, human beings began to think that they might have contempt for us, or they might doubt certain these greater beings and in how they deal with us. Anyway, so besides the mere technique of sacrificial ritual, in the course of time must have ceased to satisfy the minds both of the patron and the priests, so that more philosophic food was required, and questions and answers regarding the origin of the world and similar topics must have been discussed, giving rise to what are called, he says here, Brahmodayas. Brahmodayas, I think he means Brahmanas, the Brahmanas, which are also a part of the Shruti, the Samhitas, the Upanishads, the Brahmanas. Anyway. Thus, also the old mythological gods in strong flesh tints must have begun to disconcert them, and faith must have been gradually lost. So that abstract and symbolic. Okay, so let's try to understand this. So you're a householder, you engage a priest, you're doing the Vedic ceremonies like that. Now, sometimes you get the result, sometimes you don't seem to get the result. Then you question the intellectual, you question the priest. Why is it that we perform the sacrifice and we're not getting the result? Or why is it we're getting the result? Even some people might think even if it works, if we get the result, we're getting it. But when we don't get the result, we certainly may ask, why are we not getting the result? Is it because this particular God is not favoring us? Yet there's some reason for that. So the inquiry becomes more philosophical and more abstract about the nature of the gods, the nature of their relationship to us, the nature of their relationship to the origin of everything, Brahman, the nature of their relationship to the world. So all these things, push us into the Upanishadic system like that. So that abstract and symbolic embodiments of the divine idea then took the place of the gods of nature. Okay, so he's saying, so therefore, this philosophical trying to understand how the gods would do this, or why philosophically, why would we get the result, or maybe we didn't get the result of the sacrifice, then becomes more important. So we have a school of one of the 6 basic schools called Karma Mimamsa, or Purva Mimamsa, which is Karma Kanda, right? In that school, it doesn't really matter. The gods don't even really matter, because the idea is that you do the sacrifice, and philosophically you understand that by performing the ritual itself, you will get the result. And we don't really have to worry about who the gods are, whether they like it or not, don't like it. It's just an automatic thing. So that abstract and symbolic elements of the divine idea then took the place of the gods of nature. Okay, so this is his idea of how things progressed. We'll just go through it. Don't have to agree necessarily. So, and just as the rishis are seers or great saints in the Vedic times, thought they're the ones who are in their meditation saw the hymns of the Vedas. So just as the rishis thought that the several natural phenomena had some divine forces behind them, which were personified in so many gods, in the same way, they advanced one step further and came to think that all 3 were aspects of one All three what? The natural phenomena, the divine force, and the gods. All these three, right? And what took it one step forward to think that all three of these things were aspects of one and the same all-pervading divine force, which manifests itself in different phenomena. Right. Okay, so philosophically, people began to think like that. Thus, the thought gradually progressed from many gods to one being. And from the simple give and take religion, right, of I do the sacrifice, I get the result, given to me by blessed by the God, the simple give and take religion to abstruse speculations regarding the beginning and the origin of all things. So philosophy started to become more complex and more far-reaching in its way it was looked at. So, thus, Rig Veda 164 to 46. Well, that's strange. How can you have 164 to 46? Not sure about that. Anyway, maybe it's 164, 46. Okay. So declares that they call it Indra, Mitra, Varuna, and Agni, or the heavenly bird, right? The eagle carrier of Vishnu, Garutmat, right? Right? The sun. Okay, so Garutmat here may not mean Garut, it means the sun. Okay, the sages call the one being in many ways. They call it Agni, Yama, Matarishvan. Okay, so he's quoting from the Rig Veda, and the Rig Veda is saying there's all these different names, and we have thought of these things as different personalities: Indra, Mitra, Varuna, Agni, the sun, which is called here Garutmat, right? But maybe that's the one being. Maybe there's one being behind all of these. And some other, specifically Vaishnava groups and things like that, also understand, based on the statement in the Bhagavad Gita, by all the Vedas I'm to be known, where Lord Krishna says that in the Vedas there might be many names. Those names can be understood in different ways. The Indologists, when they first came to India, they would see people chanting the Vedas, and they would say Agnenaya Supataraya Yasman, which is a Vedic mantra, or Agnimi Ila Purohitam, which is the first verse of the Rig Veda, in which they would use the word Agni. So here we have Indra, Agni, Varuna, Maruta, Mitra, right? So first of all, the Indologists thought, oh, these persons are very simple, you know, they're praying to the fire. So they're seeing personified forces in nature, and they're seeing forces in nature like fire, like water, like wind, like the sun, and they are personifying them. They're anthropomorphizing them. They're making them more like human things. They're turning them into gods. Okay, like that. So that was the Indologist idea. So, but Agni has another meaning. Agni may have another meaning. It's not just the fire. It's also the demigod, or the Devata in Sanskrit, we say, the personality behind the fire. And then further on than that, even the supreme Brahman, the supreme Sriman Narayana, is the Antaryamin, or the indwelling spirit in Agni, like that, which can also be understood by the word Agni. So Agni can have these three meanings. Agni can have the meaning of just a fire. It can have the meaning of a force, a personality who is the force behind the fire, or it can have a meaning of the supreme who is ultimately indweller in the fire and in the personality of the fire. So Agni can all mean all those things. So some Vaishnavas, especially Sri Vaishnavas and other forms of Vaishnavism, understand the word Agni to be, or any of these words, words which are taken by some people to be in different personalities, to mean the primary meaning of the word is it's the name of the Supreme, or Brahman, or Sriman Narayana, as we say. Okay, so now this whole hymn, so he just quoted verse 46 from Rig Veda 164. So it's the 164th Sukta of the Rig Veda, verse 46, excuse me. So this whole hymn, 164 of the Rig Veda, consisting of 52 verses, is nothing but a collection of riddles to which no answers are given. The subjects of these riddles are cosmic, that is, pertaining to the nature phenomena of the universe. Mythological, that is, referring to the accepted legends about gods. Psychological, that is, pertaining to the human organs and sensations. And finally, crude and tentative philosophy or theology. Heaven and earth, sun and moon, air, clouds and rain, the course of the sun, the year, the seasons, months, days, and nights. Human voice, self-consciousness, life and death, the origin of the first creature, and the originator of the universe. Such are the abrupt and bold themes. Thus, already in certain hymns of the Rig Veda, there emerges the thought with which philosophy begins, the conception of the unity of the world, which later rose up to monism. Monism meaning Advaita Vedanta, right? Monism, that everything is actually just one thing. Perceiving, so the unity of the world, because when we start thinking about the source of the world, the source of the individual souls, the source of God, like that, when we're looking for the source, right, then we tend to first of all come to this monistic idea that everything is one in some way. So, which later rose up to monism, perceiving through the veil of the manifold, the veil of difference and multiplicity, the unity which underlies it. In this connection, may be particularly noticed the hymn 10.121, right? So Rig Veda 10.121, where Hiranyagarbha, I think this is a pretty famous hymn, Hiranyagarbha, right, is Hiranyagarbha. Hiranya means golden, and Garbha means like an egg or an embryo. Yeah, Garbha. So is described as existing in the beginning of creation. So the idea is that there was everything was like, in scientific terms, you might be before the Big Bang, some sort of thing was there before it all exploded. So anyway, in the Veda, it's a hymn to Hiranyagarbha. Again, to be understood as meaning Brahman, is described as existing in the beginning of creation, the sole Lord of beings, supporting heaven and earth. Now we have the famous Rig Veda 10.90, which is, of course, the Purusha Suktam, right? Which is a very favorite hymn of Vaishnavas, like that, which describes wherein the whole world is conceived of as one being, the Virat Purusha. Virat means the universe, the universal person, who, having pervaded it on all sides, from all sides, so from outside and from inside, it's completely pervaded, right? Another word for pervasion, all pervasion, is Vishnu. Another word for all pervasion is Vasudeva, right? In Sanskrit, right? So pervasion from inside and from outside, pervading from all sides, still remained above, over and above it. So this is he's translating basically the first verse of Purusha Sukta here, Sahasra Shirsha Purushaha, the 1,000-headed Purusha, the universal person. Sahasraksha Sahasrapat, Sahasraksha, he has thousands of eyes. Sahasrapat, thousands of feet, right? What it doesn't actually mean thousands of heads, thousands of eyes, thousands of feet. When the word Sahasra in this sense means unlimited, it means infinite. It's a synonym for infinity. The person with infinity of hands, heads, and feet, like that, right? He pervades everything, from within everything and outside of everything, right? And yet he also is separate from that. He also appears apart from that. Atyatishtad dasangulam. Dasangulam means an angula is a length, the breadth of a finger. Dasangulas are, if you put your two sets of fingers like that, you've got 8 fingers, and another 2 on top becomes this, what we call one pradesha, right? So this is the size of that personality, who is the universal Purusha, the universal Lord, Atyadishta Sanglam. When he also he pervades everything from inside and outside, but he also exists in a form which is separate from that, and that form is this big. And in other places in the Vedas and the Upanishads, it speaks about that form being in the heart of the living being, like that. So that the human heart looks like an inverted lotus bud, like a lotus flower, but closed up, inverted is what a human heart looks like. And within the heart, the lotus of the heart, that form of Narayana is there, like that. So that's described in other Upanishads and things like that. So that's the idea. So this also is there in the Rig Veda, Purusha Suktam. So having pervaded it from all sides, still remained over and above it. Then we have in 1082, where the waters, this may be a hymn using the term Varuna, right? Where the waters are spoken of as being the first substance or the prime cause. So then 1081, where the Supreme is addressed as Vishwakarman, who combines in his person the characters of a primeval divine sacrificer and of a creator, in which the cosmological significance of the divine sacrifice finds particular expression, and questioned like, what was the place whereon he took his station, right? So the origin of everything, where was he? Where was he situated? What was it that supported him? How was it? Verse 2 are boldly asked. 10.125. So these are all questions which are asked in the Veda. They are now going to be described. The answers are going to be described in the Upanishads. So 10, Rig Veda 10.125, where Vak meaning speech, right, which later becomes personified as a goddess Saraswati, right, is represented as the companion and upholder of the gods, and as the foundation of all religious activity and its attendant boons, from which we get the idea that the different devatas and even the Supreme can be expressed through speech in the form of mantras or Sanskrit spells, right? So as 10.129, which is quite typical in character and remains unsurpassed in its noble simplicity and in the loftiness of its philosophical vision, as it attempts to explain the presence of the world and its contents beyond the point of mere individual experience or analysis through empirical knowledge, right? Scientific empirical knowledge, right? By putting forth a fundamental principle without personality, right? So he's basically saying the next philosophical speculation or understanding was monism, that the essence or the underlying substratum of all the world, including the souls and the material world or whatever, and even the gods, was this fundamental principle of unity, which was a fundamental principle without any actual personality, like that. Very philosophical, monistic type of understanding. So a cursory glance at these hymns will show that the general trend of thought is principally cosmological rather than metaphysical in the proper sense of the word. Okay. So you're still looking at things in a cosmological sort of way. Hence, we may call this period cosmological. One thing to be noticed in connection with this early philosophy of the Vedas, however, is the absence of pessimism, right, and metempsychosis, which are the distinguishing traits of latter Indian philosophy. All right, so that was his idea of the Vedic period. Next, we come to the Upanishadic period. So,
just 1 second.
Yeah.
If I may. So his conclusion is that there is a complete absence of pessimism and metempsychosis, or if somebody's going to listen, of reincarnation or embodiment or re-embodiment during the Vedic period. Am I right? Did I get it right?
Um,
That's his conclusion. The conclusion of the author.
I think he's trying to describe what he thinks was going on in the Vedic times, as far as he already said that he didn't think that people in the Vedic times were really very much absorbed with eschatology and what happens after death. So that's his idea. Okay, so we you know, it's, you know, we take it with a grain of salt, and we have to move on, because you know, this may be the way that Western academics still see it. I don't know. There may be people who don't agree. I definitely think it's he's taking some liberties with the way he understands what people were thinking at the time when the Vedic hymns were the only spiritual things around, and Vedic sacrifice was the only way to worship God. So what can I say? Is that seems to be what he's saying. We don't have to, agree necessarily with all the points. Yeah. So I agree with you. That's what he's saying. Okay. So the Upanishadic period, the second period of course, and this is all just a preface to the actual book. He's going to be describing, obviously, he's going to be describing the Upanishadic philosophy a lot more, because he's dealing with Vedanta, not the Vedic understanding, but the Upanishadic understanding. So the second period of Indian philosophy, that of the Upanishads, is quite distinct in character from the first, though it is but the natural result of it. I think he's trying to show a progression of thought here. It's his idea. So if the thought during the first period was mainly religious and cosmological, with only a trace here and there of philosophy proper, the second period was mainly philosophical, though not in the narrow sense of the word, that is, having a cut and dry system of philosophy. The elaborate and mechanical system of worship that had grown up around the Vedic gods, and the speculations as regards to the appropriateness of rules, which is dealt with very much in Karmakanda, in Jaimini Sutras, right? So we have the Vedanta Sutras, or Brahma Sutras, which he's going to deal with. But previous to that, in the Sutra period, we also had what was called the Karma Mimamsa Sutras, or the Jaimini Sutras, right? So the Brahma Sutras start out Atata Brahma Jigyasa. Now is the time to study what is Brahman, what is the Supreme. But the Dharma Sutras start out Atata Dharma Jigyasa. Now is to understand, we have to understand what is the ritual. Now we should study what the ritual is, because they wanted to perform the ritual, the Vedic ritual. Okay, so the elaborate mechanical system of worship that had grown up around the Vedic gods, and the speculations as regards the appropriateness of rules and modes of worship and their efficacy for man's good in this world and the next. So even he admits here, that there's some idea of the next world, right? So even if it was just a rudimentary idea that by performing sacrifices that I would have a better life in the next life, whether that life is here or in some other place, right? And the efficacy for man's good in this world and the next, which prevails in the Brahmanas, right? So we're talking about the Samhitas and the Brahmanas, which he seems to be saying, he putting in two categories. He's not talking about the Aranyakas at all, but he probably means Samhitas, Brahmanas, and Aranyakas all form one Vedic sort of thing, and then Upanishads he's going to take separately. Whereas most people take all those four to be Vedic literature, right, together. So he's has a slightly different idea. No longer satisfied the religious spirit of the people. Okay. because they began to inquire more philosophically. Okay, so the overdoing of the sacrificial cult brought on its own downfall. It just got so the sacrifices become so big, and they become so difficult to perform, and the rules become so complex that people lose faith in them just because of their complexity, and they don't see the point anymore. Yeah, so they start inquiring into more philosophical terms. So, and people's thoughts were naturally drawn to subjects of more spiritual character, such as problems about God, man, and the world. And a variety of solutions was arrived at. Knowledge, and not mere ceremonies, right? Ceremonial acts, is the way to happiness. And there's a quote about that. That is the keynote of the literature of this period. So we went from karma, performing actions, meaning the sacrifices and things, right? The Vedic sacrifices, to jnana, knowledge, being important, because we have, of course, Shankara's famous dictum, jnanat mokshaha, from knowledge comes liberation. So here we have the Upanishads, unsurpassed in their freedom and comprehensiveness and grandeur of thought, are simply marvelous, and nowhere else can we find such a simplicity and naivete of style, combined with profundity and depth of idea, a circumstance which makes them untranslatable. Okay, that's a very interesting sentence, right? So he praises the Upanishads as being great and comprehensive and wonderful, like that, and then he says, therefore, they're, because of these reasons, they're practically untranslatable. Okay, well, they're not untranslatable, but we have to try to find a common theme in them if we want to understand them to be all preaching the same philosophy, right? So on the question as to what the Upanishads teach, now we're getting to it. Or, in other words, what is the nature of the philosophy of this period? There are, so to speak, two views, though one of them is gradually becoming more prevalent, the more prevalent one. Okay. Many eminent scholars, along with the Orthodox people, especially about Maharashtra, which means Western India, right, hold that the Vedanta of Shankara, right, meaning Adi Shankaracharya, right, the propagator of the Advaita school or monist school of Vedanta, represents the true teaching of the Upanishads, and that the other so-called Orthodox systems, as well as the other schools of Vedanta, the other Orthodox systems being, as I said, Yoga, Sankhya, Nyaya, Vaisheshika, and Purva Mimamsa. So those are the other five, and Vedanta is the sixth, which basically conquered all these other schools, or right, of philosophy in India, right? And so these are all schools of philosophy that owe allegiance to the Vedas, to the Vedic understanding, right? There are other non-Vedic schools too, like Bodha, Jaina, like that, Charvaka, atheism, right? So there are different, what we call Nastika schools, right, of Indian philosophy, or some people would call it atheistic schools, or schools that do not align themselves with the Vedas. And then of the schools that align themselves with the Vedas, we have those six, as I said, Nyaya, Vaisheshika, Jnana, Yoga, Sankhya, Purva and Uttamamamsa, meaning Karmakanda and Vedanta. So Vedanta wins out over all these other schools, right? But the idea, so he says many eminent scholars, along with the Orthodox people, especially in Maharashtra, they hold that. He's saying that because he's from Maharashtra. Okay, so he's saying people that I know, right, in my part of India, like that, they've all become enamored, and the Westerners also, scholars, the Indologists, have all become enamored with the Vedanta of Shankara, and they understand that Shankara's idea of the Vedanta school, his explanation of Vedanta, of the Upanishadic thought, right, and the school of Vedanta, is this monistic idea, and that's really the only true teaching of Vedanta, which is of the Upanishads, which is what some people think, right? And that the others, these other schools, these other 5 schools that are not Vedanta, and the other schools of Vedanta, following Ramanuja, Madhva, Vallabha, Nimbarka, even Gaudiya, Chaitanya, whatever it is, right? These other ideas or flavors of Vedanta also, right, cannot claim to be the true, or most prevalent or most understood, most accepted form of philosophy. So that's what some people think. Right. So, and that the other so-called orthodox schools, as well as the other schools of Vedanta, while they lay claim to be based on the Upanishads, are all so many developments by a kind of degeneration of the original doctrine of the Upanishads, right? So many people think that. They think Shankara's idea of the Upanishads is the pure one, is the first one, the pure one, and that all of these other schools of Vedanta are somehow not valid because they haven't understood Shankaras fully, and they've made some mistakes, and it's a matter of degeneration. It's not a matter of evolution. In other words, that they think that from Shankara's pure philosophy, things have become degraded to these other forms of Vedanta. Right? So that's one idea. Thus, according to these people, the main idea of at least the oldest of the Upanishads, that is the Brihadaranyaka, the Chandogya, the Mundaka, and the Katha, can be summed up in the equation Brahman equals Atman equals world, taken in the strictest and most literal sense. So here we have this idea of Brahman being exactly equal to the Atman, right? Whether we believe in Paramatman or Jivatman or whatever, the spirit and the world are all exactly equal, exactly synonymous. So we just basically we don't need to define them because they're all the same thing. They're all Brahman, like that, right? Shankara's terms, Shankara would be a little bit more expressive. He would say Brahma Satyam Jagat Mithya, that this world is Brahman. Brahman Satyam. This Brahman is truth. Brahman is truth. Jagat Mithya, this world of souls, individual souls and matter and everything that we see and we experience, that is false. That is illusion, right? So that is Shankara's idea. Okay. So taken in the strictest sense and most literal sense, Brahman equals Atman equals world. Okay, so that's their idea. See especially Brihadaranyaka Upanishad 1.4, from which it follows that the Atman is the only reality. Atman is the only reality. Brahman is the only reality. Brahman equals Atman. He's just saying that same thing. Okay, so that it is the metaphysical unity which is manifested in all the empirical plurality, all plurality thus by implication reducing itself to Maya, the word Maya means illusion, that it is the knowing subject within us, and as the knowing subject is itself unknowable. Okay, so there's a little bit of word play here, which we should talk about. So Shankara's philosophy is basically that everything is Brahman. Everything is one homogeneous spiritual thing which has no qualities, right? And so he says, his answer for why we see differentiation in this world is, he says, he has a theory called adhyasa. Adhyasa means that there's a superimposition of illusion, Maya, or ignorance, ajnana, on top of this Brahman. And somehow when illusion or when ignorance covers this Brahman, it appears to be the world of matter and souls, or even of devatas, even of gods. Okay, so so as you say in the chat, there are many people who have begun to understand this theory of Shankara's, this idea of Shankara's. Okay, so he's quoting some Sanskrit down here from Brihadaranyaka Upanishad. We could go and look it up sometime if we want to know more about it, but let's move on because this is just an introduction. So also saying, as I want to push back on this idea that as a knowing subject, it itself is unknowable. Okay, so the idea usually in Western philosophy is Descartes said, "I think, therefore I am," right? So I'm thinking, and I'm able to think, I'm able to understand that I exist, like that. What he's saying here is that Shankara has this idea of Brahman. Brahman doesn't even, what he's saying here is that the subject itself is unknowable, Well, really, is it unknowable even by itself? That would be the response by the Western philosopher. Okay, so this idea of illusion or ignorance, Maya or Ajnana, covering Brahman, and therefore it appears to be plural, but it's actually monistic, it's actually one, right? And that somehow or other that one is a knowing subject, right? Is a knowing subject. And that as this knowing subject, it itself is unknowable, right? When we start getting into phrases like this, we have to point out that what he's saying is totally illogical here, right? Because in order for there to be knowledge, there has to be a knower, there has to be a known, and there has to be a process of the knower knowing the known, right? So there has to be three things involved in knowledge, right? A knower, a person who is knowing something, the thing which is to be known, even if that thing is the knower himself, right? To know yourself, right? And there's a process by which one knows, which is the process of knowing. So knower, knowing, and that which is known has to be there for knowledge to exist, right? Like that. If you say that there is a knowing subject and the subject can't know anything, then there's, what's the point of using the adjective? What's the point of using the adjective knowing? Just say that there's a subject. This is what basically Shankara is saying. There's Brahman, and Brahman has no qualities. If it has no qualities, it means it's not conscious, doesn't know anything, can't even understand itself. I mean, it's very, very, in other words, very limiting. Okay, so this is where Advaita Vedanta sort of breaks down, is it's unable to explain how there can be knowledge at all, right? So this is my first point here. Thus, through the expression Maya in the strict sense of ignorance or avidya, illusion, I disagree with him here. He says Maya in the strict sense ignorance or avidya or illusion. Avidya means avidya. Vidya means knowledge. Avidya means ignorance. Maya means illusion. Maya, that which is not, right, is illusion. So he has, don't get confused at what those two mean, right? So knowledge is a result of an intelligent being indeed. Yes, correct. Okay, so let's continue on. So thus, through the expression Maya in the strict sense of ignorance or avidya or illusion may be of a later date, still the doctrine that the universe is illusory was taught by the Upanishads, maybe, according to him, right? And the older texts of the Upanishads are the most uncompromisingly and expressly do they maintain this illusory character of the world of experience. The exponents of this view further add that this bold and absolute idealism, right, as taught, for instance, in the so-called Yajnavalkya chapter of Brihadaranyaka, later degenerated first into pantheism, right, which we were talking about before, God and the forces of nature, right, then into theism, and lastly into materialism. Okay, so he's going to have to explain that. He's suggesting that. intelligence is a result of consciousness, and consciousness is a symptom of being. Yes, of course. So, for the denial of the existence of the world, as it appears to us, implied by the idealism of the old Upanishads, could not be maintained in the face of the reality of the world, which forced itself upon people's minds. Thus, the attempt to reconcile the two, the bold idealism and the reality of the world, led to pantheism, right? So understand God within, or spirit within the world, right? According to which the world is real, and yet Atma, right, or Brahman, right, the supreme spirit, the spirit, is the only reality. For the world is Atma, Chandogya Upanishad 3:14. Thus, the equation that the world is equal to Atma led to the theory of causality, right? So we have two ideas here. There actually is three ideas, but we'll talk with two. There's two ideas, what we call Vaivartavad and Parinamavad. So Vaivartavad is, Shankara's idea is that the world was caused, the world is caused, the world of plurality of the souls and the universe and the devas and whatever, is caused from Brahman, by the covering of Brahman by ignorance or illusion, Maya or avidya. That is called adhyasa. That calls what we call Vaivartavad, which is, it is not actually transformed into the world, Brahman, but is actually still Brahman, but it appears to be the world. So the world is simply an appearance or an illusion, right? Whereas the other idea is called Parinamavada, which is accepted by the Vaishnava commentators on Vedanta, right? That the world is a true transformation of Brahman. It's a true transformation of Brahman. Brahman is transformed into the world. Okay, in some way. Okay, so thus the equation that the world is equal to the Atma led to the theory of causality, to cosmogonism, according to which Brahman itself entered into the creation as the individual soul. This pantheism has to be distinguished from theism, which is the characteristic feature of certain of the later Upanishads, like Svetashvatara Upanishad, which is practically Vaishnava Upanishad. The absolute identity of Brahman and Atman, though perfectly true from the metaphysical standpoint, remains incomprehensible for the empirical view of things, which distinguishes a plurality of souls different from each other and from the highest spirit, the creative power of the universe. This is theism. Okay, so he's distinguishing between this type of pantheism, where the supreme enters, the spirit is the underlying substratum of all the world, to the idea that there are these separate atmas, separate jivas, separate souls, and there's also a separate world, and there's also Brahman is also separate in some way, right? So there's a plurality, right? So pantheism, he still feels has a substratum of monism in it, like that. So then he speaks about what theism is. According to theism, there are three entities: the real world, Achit, right? Achit means unconscious, the unconsciousness, right? Chit, Atman, the conscious individual self, and Brahman, of which the Chit and Chit form the body. Now that's exactly what Ramanuja says. That's exactly what Ramanuja says. According to this, right, the three entities are the real world, Chit, Achit, the Atman or the Jiva, Chit, and Brahman, who is called Ishvara in Ramanuja's philosophy, right? Of which the Chit and Chit form the body. This is called Sharira Shariri Bhava, right? The idea that that just as we have a body and we have a soul within the body, right? Similarly, the universe is like the body of God, and we are like the within the body of God. So God is within us. God is within us. He's supporting us, like the soul supports the body. Without the soul, the body falls down dead, right? With the soul is supporting us and maintaining us and pervading us. So the Lord is supporting and maintaining and pervading us. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. So now we're getting to it. But in course of time, the necessity of Brahman apart from Atman ceased to be felt, and its creative power was attributed to Prakriti. Okay. So there are even some Vaishnava philosophers like Madhva who do not really believe in Parinamavad, because while they believe that the Supreme, right, Brahman, Sriman Narayana, is the efficient cause of the universe, they don't believe that he's the material cause of the universe. So they believe that they believe that he is the nimitta karana, but not the upadana karana, right? In Sanskrit terms. We'll get to that. Okay. But in the course of time, the necessity of Brahman apart from Atman ceased to be felt, and its creative power was attributed to Prakriti, or material nature, just nature by itself, right? Non-intelligent, but at the same time independent of any intelligent being, which led to the materialistic dualism of the Sankhya doctrine later on. Okay, so Sankhya was one of those other five schools that were allied to the Vedas. And Sankhya, the word Sankhya in Sanskrit simply means counting, and basically it's Vedic empiricism. So it's the Vedic science of telling us how the elements were created and all this sort of thing like that. There are two forms of Sankhya, by the way. There's what we call Ishvara Sankhya and Nirishvara Sankhya. So Sankhya, there's an atheistic form of Sankhya that doesn't have God in it, that says what he's saying here, that Prakriti, or material nature, is the thing from which everything else came from, like that. So this is similar to what material science says today, that everything was created out of atoms. And the soul is just a bunch of atoms put together, and it becomes conscious somehow, like that. All right. So this is one theory. This is Nirishvara Sankhya in Vedic terms. Then there's also Ishvara Sankhya, which says that yes, Prakriti created this world of plurality that we see, but Prakriti itself owes its origin to Ishvara, or it owes its origin to the Supreme Brahman, Sriman Narayana. Okay. So continuing on. So there's those two forms of Sankhya. Right. So an impartial consideration of the Upanishads taken as a whole will, however, show that this view about the teaching of the Upanishads is not tenable. So he's saying that theism is not a tenable view of the Upanishads overall. Totally disagree, but he's got his opinion. Okay. So nor is the order in the evolution of thoughts satisfactorily demonstrable, nor is the order in the evolution of thought satisfactorily demonstrable. Okay, so he's saying that he has his idea of the evolution of thought of human beings about philosophy and theology, and he's saying that he doesn't see any other way. The Upanishads are nothing but free and bold attempts to find out the truth without the slightest idea of a system. That's what he says. Okay. And to say that any one particular doctrine is taught in the Upanishads is unjustifiable in the face of the fact that in one and the same section of the Upanishads, we find passages, one following the other, which are quite opposed to their purport. Okay. Right. So let me just say something about this. So this is what people have found in the Upanishads. They've found what we call Abheda Shrutis. Abheda Shrutis means passages in the Vedas, in the Upanishads, that speak of oneness of everything, monism. There are, say, Bheda Shrutis. Bheda means difference. So they found other passages, maybe even in the same Upanishad, which talk about difference, which talk about plurality. So that's why he's saying you can't have one system. There's also passages which talk about plurality and monism at the same time, even in one passage. These are called Ghatika Shrutis. So Ramanuja says there's Bheda, Abheda, and Ghatika Shrutis. There are these three different types of statements in the Vedas and the Upanishads. But he says it is possible to rationalize them. It is possible to form a consistent, coherent, rational philosophy, one philosophy that accepts all these statements. And that's what we're going to look at. So bold realism, pantheism, theism, materialism are all scattered about here and there, and the chronological order of the Upanishads has not been sufficiently established on independent grounds so as to justify us in claiming that one particular view predominating in the certain number of Upanishads, granting that this is possible, represents the teachings of all the Upanishads, or of the Upanishads, right? So he's saying that, but that's what Ramanuja attempted to do and to say, and that's, admittedly, that's what all the commenters on Vedanta are saying. Now, what he's saying also here is the Upanishads seem to have all different philosophical points here and there, some contradictory, whatever it is. So he's probably going to bring up the point about how in the Vedanta Sutras, the author of the Vedanta Sutras has decided to put things in a chronological order, in a rational logical order, to put philosophy in a step-by-step logical order. And that's the idea of Vedanta Sutras. Whereas if you just read the Upanishads, statements come, all sorts of, there's an Abheda Shruti, Ghataka Shruti, all coming at you in different forms and on different subjects. And it's very difficult to make a comprehensive study and understand philosophy step by step by just reading the Upanishads. So that's why we read the Vedanta Sutras, because they put things in logical sequence. Okay, so now, what did it say? To say that idealism represents the real teaching of the Upanishads because it is contained in a certain Upanishad, which is relatively old, and that the Upanishad is relatively old because it contains the view of things with which philosophy should commence, is nothing but a logical seesaw, right? So he's basically saying that it's a straw man argument. It's not a good argument to say this Upanishad we believe is old because it speaks of monism, and this Upanishad, like for instance the Chandogya Brihadaranyaka or Mundaka or Kata, we believe are old, but we believe that the Svetashvatara was newer because we see pluralism being described in the Svetashvatara more, and monism being described in the others. Yeah, there's a logical fallacy there, right? We have decided that monism comes first and pluralism comes afterwards, and therefore we say we're dating the Upanishads in that way. But that's completely bogus. That's coming to a conclusion and making another conclusion based on your previous conclusion, which hasn't been proved, right? So that's completely illogical. That's what he's saying, right? And I totally agree with him. Logical seesaw. So it may be true that if one insists on drawing a system from the Upanishads, replete as they are with the contradictions and divergencies, Shankara has succeeded the best because his distinction of esoteric and exoteric doctrines, like a sword with two edges, can easily reconcile all opposites such as unity and plurality, assertions of attributes and their negation, the connection with one and the same being. But this is one thing, and to say that the Upanishads taught Shankara's doctrine is quite another thing. Okay, so what he's saying is that some people say, okay, maybe you can't prove that Shankara, that the Upanishads taught Shankara's doctrine. But they say, look, Shankara's doctrine is the best one to prove all these inconsistencies between the Ghataka Shrutis and the Beta and Beta Shrutis, like that. But that's not necessarily true either, right? So different people have their different opinions. Obviously, people think that Shankara's explanation of the Upanishads is better than somebody, but we can say Ramanuja or Madhva, or there are different schools of thought on this. So the whole idea of this book is to give us a focus on the comparisons between them. As regards the relative order of doctrines in the march of philosophic thought, we may as well say that the first stage is represented by materialism, maybe, right? Which is innate in us, which is persistently forced on us by our daily experience, and which very few can get rid of in practice, though there may be a few more who deny it in theory, right? So, yeah, I mean, Shankara's philosophy, it may be very nice philosophically, but it's completely irrelevant to everyday life. And it's just a mental thing, because we can't actually live that philosophy because we live in a world of pluralism. So thus, we start with plurality and difference, ascend through difference and non-difference and qualified unity until at last we reach the highest top, absolute unity. Okay, so this is also the idea of Shankara, is that there are two levels here. We have what we call the paramartic level, where everything is one, the topmost supreme level where everything is one, and the ordinary level that we see around us of plurality, which is called the Vyavaharika level. And he gives examples. There are examples that we could give. I could give an example, like when we get in a balloon or an airplane and we go up in the air, and if we go up high enough, then we see the curve of the earth, because the earth is a ball. So we see the curve of the earth. But if we are down on this plane, when we're down here, we look out and we see the earth to be flat. You know, maybe there's some mountains and things like that, but basically flat, like that. And we can walk and we can drive and we can go, and we'll never come to a place where we see the earth tipping over in a curve like this. So many people, ancient peoples, believed that the world was flat. But then when we get a higher perspective, we see the reality is that the world is round, or is a globe. So that's the thing. That's an example to explain Vyavaharika level, the materialistic level, and of plurality, and the Paramartika level, like that. Yes, and there are flat Earth people. That's correct. Okay, they're even today, like that. Although some of them still fly in airplanes and they still talk to each other in different time zones, and they have all these crazy conspiracy theories about how it's actually flat, but it's not. Okay, so anyway, so thus we start with plurality and difference, and ascend through difference and non-difference and qualified unity, and at last we stand to the highest top, absolute unity. Okay, that's the idea of the people who believe in absolute unity, right? Or Kaivalya Advaita, right? So thus, the other view regarding the teachings of the Upanishads, according to which the Upanishads teach not one, but many systems of doctrines regarding the nature of God, man, and the world, and the relations between them, is more reasonable, and it is being more and more accepted. The germ of all the later systems, whether orthodox or heterodox, orthodox meaning following the Vedas, heterodox meaning opposed to the Vedas, usually, can be found in them. And as is, well, here he's just talking about the Upanishads, as is evident from the fact that all the religio-philosophic systems of later times can quote a certain number of passages for them in their support. But when the exponents of these systems try to show that theirs is the only system taught by the Upanishads, and attempt to explain passages even when directly opposed to the tenor of their doctrine, in a manner so as to favor their doctrine, the artificiality and the unsatisfactory character of the attempt is at once evident. For the Upanishads represent a large floating mass of speculations of old seers clothed in words and handed down orally, speculations depending on the mood of the thinker and the point of view from which he looked. For example, we have the example of how Madhva tries to explain the word aham brahmasmi. Aham means I, right? Refers to the individual soul. Aham brahmasmi. I am. It's literally means I am Brahman. I am spiritual. Now, it can be understood by different people in certain different ways. We can also say aham brahmasmi means I'm spiritual. Some people take it more literally and say I am Brahman. I'm the supreme Brahman, right? Madhva takes it to mean I am not Brahman. I am not Brahman. So somehow or other, he takes the completely opposite view of what that statement means. Okay, so what he's saying is, these when people who have a certain number of statements in the Upanishads to back up their philosophical school, when they try to explain the other statements, they have a hard time. Right. So, in spite of this free and unfettered character of the Upanishads, however, it must be admitted that they are on the whole more favorable to Uttaramimamsa or Vedanta, taken in its larger sense, than to any other system, any of those other 5 systems, right? Sankhya, Yoga, Nyaya Vaisheshika, or Karmakanda, Purvamimamsa. So Vedanta is explaining the Upanishads in the best way, right? So than to any other system, and that we find there some ideas that stand out more conspicuously than others, such as, for instance, the immortality of the soul, its metempsychosis and transmigration, including the way of the fathers, right, meaning the forefathers, as the performers of sacrifices and virtuous actions, the way of the gods for the possessor of knowledge, and the third place, the doers of evil deeds, the superiority of knowledge and meditation to action as means of attaining liberation, and above all, a constant striving after the reconciliation of unity and plurality of idealism and realism. Such is, in general, the character of the second or Upanishadic period of Indian philosophy, which we have also called metaphysical, to distinguish it from the first, since it concerned itself also with speculations about man and his inner soul, his inner activities, and the processes of his thought and will, and not merely about questions about nature, cosmic matter, etc., as was the case in the first period. In brief, since it saw the beginnings of psychological, ethical, and metaphysical problems. Next, we come to the post-Vedic or systematic period, which saw the development of the so-called 6 darshanas, or orthodox schools, as well as the heterodox schools, such as Buddhism, Jainism, and we can say Indian atheism, Charvaka. As said above, the germs of all these systems are already present in the Upanishads, and what these systems did was to take up particular parts of the Upanishads and deduce from them a cut and dry system, conniving at or explaining away in a far-fetched manner those parts which did not suit the particular system. This systematic period may be supposed to have begun with the collections of sutras, meaning short aphorisms or threads. Even today, when we have emails, we have discussions and we call those things threads, right? Which are regarded as the foundations of the several systems, and the dates and authors of which have not yet been determined with precision and accuracy. In the intervening stage between the Vedas and the Upanishads, on the other hand, and the sutras on one hand, and sutras on the other, represented by the philosophical portions in the Mahabharata, for example, the Bhagavad Gita, Sanat Sujatiya Parva, right, the Moksha Dharma, etc., portions of which that form the common basis of Buddhism and Sankhya, which were, however, as far from containing a systematic doctrine as the Upanishads themselves, and terms like Sankhya and Yoga frequently to be met with there do not signify the names of the later systems, Sankhya and Yoga, right, which we talked about before, called by those names, but mean merely reflection and concentration, in which sense they are used also when they first occur in the Svatashvatara Upanishad 6:13. Right? What he's saying here is he's dating the Mahabharata, the Bhagavad Gita, and the other parts of the Mahabharata, with the Moksha Dharma section, the Sanat Sujatiya section, right, as being before Buddhism, Sankhya, modern Sankhya, etc.
Om Namo Narayanaya. Om Namo Narayanaya.